And it is my great pleasure to welcome Rabbi Garry Wayland to give this afternoon's Lunch and Learn shiur on Esther and Daniel and dealing with megalomaniacal egos. Over to you.
Thank you. 1 second. Let me just organise my screen a little bit. I'm going to do screen share for most of this. I don't know if that's what most of your speakers end up doing. Hi everyone. Lovely to be back in Kinloss, or virtually. I don't know where you guys are all listening from. I saw someone's in Leeds, so why not? It can be spread wide and far. I've done a lot of teaching over Zoom, and sort of the other day I sort of noticed that some kid was like, his looked a bit too bright to be England, so he confessed he'd gone to Israel in the middle of lockdown, so legally he had gone to Israel, and amazingly had the vaccination there as well. So if I see any bright lights in the background, I know where you're not. So I want to have a look, obviously, at the book of Esther, but more broadly, what some of the main themes in the book of Esther. It really is one of my favourite. It's most amazing biblical book. There is so much in it, so we obviously can't cover all of it. So I'm going to pick up one particular theme. Just to have a look over here. This is assume you guys can see the screen share okay. So this is a timeline, just a bit of context. Quick plug, I don't know if any of you have seen this. I'm sure Rabbi Lawrence has plugged this. It really is fantastic, the Koran Tanakh of the land of Israel. So this timeline is taken from the front of it, and it's the first time I've ever seen anything like this with sort of such clarity. So obviously a very broad overview. Excuse the scan, I just did it on my phone quickly beforehand. So 1 second, let me just get a pointer up. So just to give a sense of where everything is over here. So obviously towards the right hand side is the year 0 CE, and over here they've got the different layers of different types of history, some of which were more short-lived, some of which were longer-lived. So right now we're learning about Egypt in the Persia, so that's all the way over there. Egypt, for a different time, is extremely old. The pyramids had been around for 2,000 years before Moshe came along. So we are going to be interested in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is, in a sense, Iraq, Iran. We'll have a look at a map in a second, and it hasn't come out the best. But I'm just going to zoom in. So over here, we have got the first temple, and 1 second. Right, so that you should be able to see all of that on one page. So over here we've got the first temple built in 960 apparently by Shlomo Melech. Lasted for 400 or so years. Then at the same time, sort of roughly 150 years or so into the first temple, the Assyrians and then the Babylonians came into power. So that's this line over here. So obviously over here you can see the Neo-Babylonian Empire. I don't know if you can just make that out, that green blob over there. So that time period coincides with the end of the first temple. So we're going to be looking at one of the main antagonists of that period. So Nebuchadnezzar was the evil king who was in charge of the Babylonian Empire over there. We'll see. He does have some nuance to him, which is what we're going to be looking at. So he was the one who destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. He destroyed the temple. We've got that small gap over there. So that small gap over there is the 70 years between the first and second temples, and then obviously we've got the second temple, which runs up till 70 CE, obviously destroyed in the early days of the sort of rise of Christianity, and sort of the depths of the Roman Empire. And then over here, again, it hasn't come out so clearly, but over here it says the Persian Empire. So we're going to be looking at that transition, and the Purim story happens in the Persian Empire. Again, the precise dating is not completely clear. We know it's the third year of Ahasuerus's rule, and it's sort of, if you see over here, can't quite. They've put it to be 538, which conveniently is the same time as the start of the Second Temple. There is some discrepancy about this the timing of the Purim story, but that's a different discussion for a different time. So that's just to give everything a sort of a timeline overview. Going over here, that's the Hasmoneans over there. Just why it caught my eye. That's the obviously the Hanukkah story. It's very, very late in the Second Temple period. So let's have a look at some maps, because I love maps. Okay. So I found this on National Geographic. So over here, this is the empire of Nebuchadnezzar. They've spelled it here Nebuchadrezzar, which is how it's spelled in a few places in Tanakh. So over here we've got the Persian Gulf, Israel over here. It didn't go all the way down to Eretz as well. That's Elat over there. Egypt followed that direction, and then sort of his empire went all the way around there. I'm not sure who was in the middle. But that was his empire. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. Nineveh there's tons of stuff in Nineveh in the British Museum. And obviously we've got Babylon over there. That sort of cuts its way through modern day Iraq. So that's Syria up there. Iraq kind of up there, and then Iran is all of this roughly, I think, if I've got my geography correct. So that was the Babylonian Empire. So obviously he started in Babylon, and then Nebuchadnezzar came, and then eventually made his way to Jerusalem and then destroyed the temple. And then the Jews went kind of backwards. They were taken to the rivers of Babylon. So you can see the rivers of Babylon over here, where they sat, and obviously that's the famous psalm. And many of the Jews sort of, incidentally, they stayed around here for many years, till about 1000 CE. So that's where the great the great yeshivot of the Babylonian Talmud were, on roughly in that area over there, near those rivers. So the community was still there until about 1000 CE, and eventually they dissipated. So that's the Babylonian Empire. And over here, from a slightly different place, this is the Persian Empire. So the Persian Empire took over from Babylonia. Obviously very, very similar. Its base is a bit further away, so there's Persia. We'll try and find I'll try and find it later. Shushan is somewhere in modern day Iran. You can go to Shushan. I didn't know till recently, but they've actually excavated the palace of Shushan, and you can go and see bits. I don't know where they are, but I don't know a huge amount about it, but we've got the palace of Shushan. I'm sure Rabbi Lawrence is looking it up as we speak. And so this is the Persian Empire, a lot larger, going all the way up to Turkey, Macedonia, up there on top of Greece. So obviously the Megillah starts off telling us that Ahasuerus had an empire which went from Hodu to Kush, which is translated as India, to Ethiopia. So India obviously on this side. I think when obviously over here is not really into India, but sort of touching India. Again, where the modern borders are, I have no idea. And then Ethiopia is kind of down at the bottom over there. Okay, so those are the two empires over there. So that's just really important for the context over here. And obviously here, quietly, sort of towards the edge over here, is Eretz Israel over there. Okay. Questions, thoughts, comments? Are we all okay? Yeah, feel free to speak, or to say something into the chat, or just stop me or whatever. Okay. All right, so that's the background over here, and I think it's really important to have those maps and that timeline sort of clear, because it's really going to help. And just again, looking at the dates over here, we've got the Babylonian Empire, and then that really merges into the Persian Empire. Right, and it's really important to get the sense that they're merging from one to the other. There was no great battle. There was no war. Nebuchadnezzar lost his power. It disappeared, and then a new order came about, and that's really, really important, because we're gonna look at the two different types of leadership, which is the title of today, which is looking at sort of megalomaniacs and sort of the leaderships over there. Okay, fine. So just before we get into I suppose the actual main part of it, which is going to be looking at the book of Daniel. So this is a really, really important place to start over here. So the first person we come across in the Torah who is known as a mighty warrior, as a conqueror, is Nimrod. So Nimrod is obviously one of the it's in Nach, so he is known as the mighty warrior. Not a huge amount is said about him in the Torah. The Midrash fills in a lot of details. That he was the one who is the chief builder of the Tower of Babel, for example. But again, this is all the Torah says about Nimrod. I find it interesting. Nimrod is I don't know still, but sort of a common Israeli name. So there's a lot of background over there. I once met a Nimrod in Edinburgh University when I was working there. So he was actually a descendant of one of the most famous Hasidic Rebbes, like many generations. He wasn't from his parents were secular Israelis as well. And so again, I used to sit down and learn. He was a descendant of Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. So he is when they tell Hasidic stories, it's often about Rav Levi Yitzchak. He was an incredible personality and known for many defending the Jewish people from God and from he was a real character, and many stories are about him. So I used to learn his book Kedushas Levi with his, I think it was his sort of 9th or 10th generation descendant, who was called Nimrod. And the reason why secular Israelis tend to call their children Nimrod is because if you read the text, it just says he was mighty. That there's a certain group of Israeli society who they go for the strict word of the Torah without any commentary from our sages. So it says in the Torah that he was a mighty warrior. That sounds like a good role model. So it kind of ends up becoming an Israeli name. But this is Nimrod. And Rashi gives the background for Chazal over here. So over here, that he was a mighty one, that he separated the generations at the Tower of Babel. He ensnared people, causing them to rebel against God. And people will say in the future that anyone who acts brazenly is acting like Nimrod. Okay, so that's just a bit of background. To Nimrod, and the reason why it's important because it really helps frame the two dictators that we're going to look at today, one of whom is seen as his spiritual descendant, the other one who is going to be his counterbalance. So again, this is all by background. This is taken from the Gemara. So this is the Gemara in Chagiga. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai taught, so Nebuchadnezzar says, so this is taken from the book of Isaiah. Okay, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Right, so this is the person who we're going to meet in a couple of minutes. So Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, says about himself that I'm going to ascend above the heights. I'm going to be like God. Okay, so this is how Nebuchadnezzar viewed himself. A divine voice came and said to him, "Wicked man, son of a wicked man. You're a descendant of Nimrod the wicked, who caused the entire world to rebel against God in the time of his reign." So that's who we're going to be speaking about over here. That's how Chazal frame the first king we're going to be looking at. So this is going to be Nebuchadnezzar. So again, just going back to the map. So this is the first empire we're going to meet. Nebuchadnezzar was the one who established this empire over here. And also, if I can get it up, so Nebuchadnezzar is the one who starts the kingdom over here, right? The Neo-Babylonian Empire. So he's the one who sort of really strengthens this kingdom, and he's the one who destroys the base of Mikdash. Right. So when he does that, he destroys the base of Mikdash. And again, just a bit more background over here. So the base of Mikdash is destroyed. There is a book that we don't read in shul ever that's actually quite remarkable. It's quite famous, which is the Book of Daniel. So we're going to have a brief look at the Book of Daniel, and that's going to give us a lot of background about Nebuchadnezzar. Does anyone know, quiz question, why we don't read the Book of Daniel in shul ever? I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Anyone know why we never come across the Book of Daniel? So it's so the reason is because the Book of Daniel is part of the writings. We've obviously got Tanakh, which is split into the prophets and the writings. The prophets become what we read, the prophets and the haftarahs. So when we read the haftarahs, throughout the week, throughout the year on a Shabbos morning, the haftarahs do two things. I think the first thing is that they kind of provide a counterbalance to the Torah reading, and then you can kind of look at every single parsha, and they do one of two things: either they reinforce a message, or they provide a counterbalance to a particular message in the Torah reading of the week. But again, that's for a different time. But through that, I think most of us get a sort of a fair familiarity with the year. A lot of the book of Tanakh. Kind of we read a lot of the main stories in Joshua, in the book of Shmuel, in the book of Kings. We kind of read select highlights through the haftarahs throughout the whole year. The writings, a lot of it is often given short shrift, and it's there to be written. It's not there to be read out loud. So they were written as written texts. So because Daniel is part of the written texts, we don't often come, unless we don't come across them in our shul service on a week by week basis. But it's an amazing book. It is unique because I don't know if anyone, if just having a look at that, the right hand side over there. So that's not Hebrew. That is in Aramaic. So again, if your Hebrew is good and you're reading this, you'll recognise quite a few of the words, but quite a lot of the words you won't necessarily recognise because it's not in Hebrew. It's parts of Ezra in Aramaic as well, but it's largely in Aramaic. So over there, Malka instead of Melech, so it's quite hard to study in the original Hebrew because a lot of the grammar is different, a lot of the words are different. So Daniel starts off with Nebuchadnezzar having destroyed the temple, and what he does is he selects 4 young Jewish men to be his courtiers. So they're there as politicians. They're taken by Nebuchadnezzar, and they're there to be his advisors, and I suppose to be his intermediaries with the Jewish people. Of course, now most of the Jewish people are not living in the land of Israel; they're mostly living in his kingdom. He exiled them to Babylonia. So he takes a few of them, and we're going to see one of the very famous stories. So this jumps in halfway through. So we're jumping in halfway through over here. So he appoints them. Nebuchadnezzar. There's loads of parallels over here, by the way, and I think that's really important. Is that there's a few people who were taken to a king's palace and they acted there as advisors. So we're going to read about Daniel now. There's another 2. Esther in Ahasuerus's palace is one. There's one more, who I suppose is the paradigm, who we're not really going to look at today. So who was taken away to a foreign country to be not to be an advisor, ended up being an advisor. So of course, was that me or was that someone answering? Sorry, that was my feedback to myself. So that's Joseph. So Joseph in the Torah is, I suppose, the paradigm. He was taken away, ended up being an advisor, a leader. Of course, that's the whole story that we're not going to look at now. But there are loads and loads of parallels between these 3 stories, between Joseph in Egypt, between Esther in Ahasuerus's palace, and between Daniel in Nebuchadnezzar's palace. So that's where we are. Nebuchadnezzar has some dreams. God reveals himself to some dreams, and he doesn't know the understanding of these dreams. It's another parallel to Joseph. By the way, I apologise. I often say I'm not going to speak about this, and then I end up speaking about something. So if I do that, if I say I'm not going to speak about it, please don't take me that seriously. But I will try and stay broadly on topic. Yeah, he has dreams. Daniel is the one who interprets them. We're going to have a look at this chapter over here, which is mainly chapter 3. There's a few other key chapters in Daniel that we're not going to look at. Nebuchadnezzar is up to the first 4 chapters of Daniel. Afterwards, really Nebuchadnezzar disappears, and a king takes over called Belshazzar, who we're going to pick up a tiny bit later. Belshazzar has another dream, and that dream is, the phrase "the writings on the wall." Great phrase. Not many people So I'm sure most of you have heard the phrase "the writings on the wall." So it's actually taken from the book of Daniel. Belshazzar makes a party in the early days of his reign. He takes out the vessels from the temple. While he's doing that, some writing appears on the wall, and of course no one can understand it. And Daniel comes along, interprets it, and it says, "You're going to die," or words to that effect, and that's what happens. So that's where the phrase "the writing on the wall" comes from. It's almost a direct quote from the book of Daniel. And then after that, Daniel ends up getting thrown into the lion's pit. And then the second half of the whole book has some a series of apocalyptic visions that tend to be picked up in Christian literature much more than studied by Jews. That might be because they tend to be picked up by Christian literature. So let's see. Let's have a look at the book of Daniel now. I'm really interested in Nebuchadnezzar over here again, just to have a look at the personalities and what we can learn from him. So again, this is after he interprets the dream. He bows. The king Nebuchadnezzar prostrates himself, pays homage to Daniel, and orders that a meal offering and pleasing offerings be made to him. Okay, interesting. There was an offering to be brought for Daniel. The king said in reply, "Truly your God must be the God of gods and the King of the kings, and the revealer of mysteries, to have enabled you to reveal this mystery." So again, what happened prior to this story is Daniel interprets the dream, and all of a sudden Nebuchadnezzar is now sounding quite frum. By the way, this is a phrase that is repeated again and again in our davening, and it comes from the book from Nebuchadnezzar. We refer to Hashem as Melech Malachei Hamlachim, right? God, who is the King of Kings. Nebuchadnezzar referred to himself as the King of Kings because he was an emperor. He ruled over other kingdoms, so he called himself the King of Kings. And he refers to God as the God of gods and the Kings of kings. So that's where the phrase of referring to Hashem as the King of kings come from. Melech Malachei Hamlachim. So over here he sounds quite religious. And that's the first point where we're going to meet Nebuchadnezzar. But then after that, something happens in the next chapter, which again it has loads of parallels to the Purim story. Nebuchadnezzar made a statue of gold 60 cubits high. If we take that measure literally, that's going to be between 90 and 120 feet, which is, how's that compared to Nelson's column? It's quite high, and it's gold. 6 cubits broad. It was set up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylonia. He sent word to gather the satraps, prefects, governors, councillors, treasurers, judges, officers, and all of those people to attend it. So they all came. All the satraps, I don't know what satrap is, prefect, governor, councillor, so all the different officials come along. They come for the opening ceremony. It sounds like a sort of typical bureaucratic affair. He wants everyone to come see his great statue. And then something's going to happen over here. So the herald proclaimed in a loud voice, "You are commanded, everyone, that when you hear the hornpipe zither," anyone's got a zither? No. Lyre, psaltery, bagpipe, other kinds of instruments, to fall down and worship the statue of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So again, straight after having recognized God, he makes this massive statue of himself, and he really wants everyone to bow down to it. Whoever will not bow down and worship shall at once be thrown into the fire. Okay, so again, he's not just doing, he's doing this for his ego, but it's really backed up with a lot of, with a real threat. So, of course, the people come, they bow down, and then some people come and say, "Do you know what, the Jews, guess what they're not going to do? So why don't you test them?" So they go and bring the Jews, and Nebuchadnezzar spoke to these Jewish advisors. "Is it true that you do not serve my God or worship the statue of gold that I have set you up?" Right, so Nebuchadnezzar, having previously recognized God, is now saying, "I want you to come and worship my statue of gold." Okay. Question is over here, and I think this one I'm going to have to think of. Is Nebuchadnezzar a polytheist, or there is a word for it and I've forgotten it? What's the word for someone who believes in many gods but also one ultimate supreme power? There's a special word for it. Rabbi Lawrence? There is a word for it, or anyone for that matter. Okay, there's a specific word for it.
Polytheist, is it?
Polytheist
Monotheist is one god. Polytheist is many gods. Pantheist is one who sees God in anything and everything.
Yeah, there's a panentheist, which is one who sees God in everything, but also God being above everything as well. And there's another word, which is the word that I can't remember at the time, which is one who believes in many gods, but an ultimate God as well. Which I think most, if I'm being careful over here, most scholars would probably argue, which is what Hinduism falls in today. Again, I'm saying that from my reasonably limited knowledge, but I believe that's how they would describe it. Anyway, there is a specific word for it. That's our homework. So Nebuchadnezzar over here, it really sounds like, we can say that he believed in God, but at the same time he believed in my God. And he also didn't see anything wrong with asking people to bow down to his statue of gold. Whether he believed the statue of gold was God, what do you think? Did he says, serve my God?
Henotheism.
Sorry?
Henotheism.
Henotheism, thank you.
Henotheism.
Excellent. We can use that next time we do a crossword.
Right. The worship of a single overarching God while not denying the existence or possible existence of other lower deities.
Excellent. You can now use that in your dinner. You can now use that to sort of impress your friends with you. Right. Impressive vocabularies. So I'm just trying to look at the original Hebrew. Yeah, I mean, the English is a fairly accurate translation. Is the statue a god? What's your thoughts?
He describes it as a statue of gold, and doesn't describe it as a statue of himself.
Well, it was one second. It was a statue of. No, it never says at the beginning. It never says it was a statue of him. But is the statue a god? Not necessarily of him, but is the statue a god, or is it just a statue?
But it says, "Serve my God."
Or worship the statue of gold. It's the same refrain previously. They do not serve your God or worship the statue of gold. So I think I'm not convinced in the text one way or the other whether the statue was viewed as a god or whether it was Nebuchadnezzar was quite happy worshipping non-god things. A proof to this is that he brings offerings to Daniel. He's very impressed with Daniel. He doesn't call him God, and the next line is he acknowledges how God, Hashem, has revealed to Daniel mysteries. He doesn't acknowledge Daniel as a deity, but is still quite happy bringing offerings to him. I think I'm not sure if it's clear in the text whether he viewed the statue as being a god. And that these are two separate things, or whether the statue was a god. But anyway, so over here he obviously challenges the Jews, and we've got the three young servants, the three young courtiers. We do not, Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer in this matter, for if it shall be our God we serve is able to save us from the burning fiery furnace, he will save us from your power, O king. If he does not, be it known to you, O God, King, we will not serve your God or worship the statue of God that you have set up. Right? So they absolutely deny they're going to do anything. Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage that his visage was distorted. He gave an order to heat up the furnace to 7 times its usual heat. They were thrown into the fire. Because the king's order was urgent, the furnace was heated to an excess. A tongue of flame killed the men who carried them in, and they were thrown into the furnace. This might be reminiscent of another story. So Avraham was thrown into the furnace by, who's the person who throws Avraham into the furnace, according to the Midrash? It was Nimrod, who we met earlier. That story is a Midrash. It's not recorded in Tanakh. So the story of Avraham being thrown in the furnace is probably the most famous biblical story. It doesn't appear in Tanakh that Avraham was thrown into a fiery furnace. It's really a midrashic precursor to this story over here. Again, viewing Nimrod as being the spiritual ancestor of Nebuchadnezzar over here, and Avraham being the spiritual ancestor of these three courtiers. Okay, the three men were thrown into the furnace. Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, rising in haste, addressed his companions, saying, "Did we not throw 3 men into the fire? But here I see 4 men walking about unbound and unharmed in the fire, and the 4th looks like a divine being." And of course, an angel has come, is there with the 3 men, and they're being protected. They come out of the fire. The fire had no effect. Okay, this is an amazing line right here. Nebuchadnezzar spoke up and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel to save his servants, trusting in him, flouting the king's decree at the risk of their lives, rather than serve or worship any god but their own God." And that's really sort of the last lines are amazing over here. King Nebuchadnezzar said to all peoples, all nations, every language, and inherit the whole earth, may your well-being abound with signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. I am pleased to relate how great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion endures throughout the generations. Okay, again, that line should sound reasonably familiar. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, which is actually from Tehillim. It's from Tehillim, but obviously that's what we say for the prayer for the queen or the monarch. The fact that it comes from Nebuchadnezzar is by design. It's not an accident. And that's for a share for another time. The origins of the prayer for the monarch. It's slightly murkier than one might imagine. Anyway, so that's Nebuchadnezzar over here. Thoughts on his character? Oh my gosh, I've been going for 35 minutes already. Thoughts on his character? What do we learn about Nebuchadnezzar as a monarch? So if you're
he seems to accept the truth ultimately.
He comes to accept the truth. I mean, yeah. I mean, he's definitely kind of like very. Again, he's very much recognizing God at the end of it. I mean, he did recognize God at the beginning as well. He started off by praising the God of Daniel, but then sort of straight away he has another power trip. I mean, he certainly sees himself as being extremely powerful and extremely important. I mean, he was an emperor. That's generally an important qualification for being an emperor. And he is absolutely prepared to defend his ego, to kill people to do so. But at the same time, it seems to be that once he reaches that point, he is prepared to acknowledge the truth.
There is a Gemara somewhere, isn't there, where Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned. I can't remember the exact story, but there was a letter, a disrespectful letter was going to be sent to, was it to the Beis Hamikdash or something? And he took several steps to retrieve the letter. And it said if he'd taken one other step, he would have outdone all the Jewish people in our tshuva. Do you know the Gemara I'm referring to? In other words, he had this sort of potential for righteousness, which didn't get fulfilled.
Yeah. I mean, you definitely see that he's saying the right things. I mean, I think to have a look at the whole story, and to do this properly. So I've got a little bit of feedback. I'm just going to wait a minute for Zoom to catch up on itself. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we see through him is that he certainly saw himself as having a divine mission. He destroyed the temple, seeing it as part of a divine plan, and he saw himself as being a key part of that divine plan. And I think that's probably why he saw him, first of all, had the ego, but at the same time, viewed himself as being, was prepared to acknowledge truth when it was expressed in by the dreams, by this miracle of the men being saved. So he was certainly prepared to acknowledge the truth. But I think because he was so convinced that he was part of the divine plan, when those plans changed, he was able to accept it. I think that's an amazing thing for a extreme dictator. Okay, so that's Nebuchadnezzar. So what we're gonna do is just, again, for purposes of time, we're gonna have a look at Ahasuerus, and again we're going to do this a little bit more quickly, just because I think we're a lot more familiar with Ahasuerus. So Ahasuerus, again, here's the Purim story as it begins. So Ahasuerus was a successor to Nebuchadnezzar. There were a few short-lived kings in between him. One was Belshazzar, who was the first Persian king. So Belshazzar was the one we mentioned before, who died after using or misusing the temple property. The story of the writing on the wall. So according to Chazal, his daughter was someone called Vashti, who of course we know from Ahasuerus' wife. Chazal tell us that Ahasuerus, the king of the Purim story, was not of royal blood. He was born as a commoner. So yeah, I mean, this is the words of the Gemara. Rava said Vashti not only refused to come, but she sent a messenger. You, son of my father's stableman. Belshazzar, my father, drank wine against 1,000 men and do not become inebriated, and that man, Ahasuerus, has become senseless from his wine, and because of her audacity, his anger burned in him. So Ahasuerus came from humble stock. It's not clear whether he married into royalty and then that's how he became powerful, or he developed power and then married afterwards. I don't know if there's an answer to that. I'll leave that to Rabbi Lawrence has any thoughts on that. But that's sort of Ahasuerus' background. And of course, the Purim story starts with Ahasuerus' party. And I think from here we see almost, sort of the polar opposite of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar very much built a massive statue, brought everyone there, and the threat of death was, you bow down or you die. And of course we met the Jewish courtiers who refused to bow down. Ahasuerus is the polar opposite over here. He makes a huge party. He sort of, again, we read the details to excess at the opening of the book, and it's really absolutely striking. Sort of royal wine, the different decorations, and really over here, this is kind of the key line and sort of represents at least the start of Ahasuerus' rule. The rule for drinking was no restriction. The king had given orders to every palace steward to comply with each man's wishes. He was a popularist. He came from nothing, and to cement his rule, at least initially, it wasn't about conquering. It wasn't about fear. It was about being popular, and therefore he made the party. When he wanted to cement his rule, he didn't do it by instilling fear into the courtiers. He attacked the women. Again, that's another whole discussion. He killed Vashti, and the way of cementing his power was by sort of enshrining in law sort of a misogynistic political structure, and that's how he cemented his rule. The party of Esther was not it wasn't a beauty pageant. It was a forced harem. The women who were taken there remained there. They weren't it wasn't a party. They stayed there forevermore. So you've got almost the opposite of Nebuchadnezzar. You've got someone over here who was a popularist to excess, but in the end, he tries to cement his rule again by taking control of the women, killing Vashti, and then having the party. But in the end, Ahasuerus' end is that although he is the king at the end of the story, he is so malleable. He gets manipulated by everyone. Initially by Haman, and then eventually, Esther and Mordecai then take in effect control of the kingdom. So over here, you've got sort of almost two opposites. two opposite types of ruler. I just want to show this quote from Rav Soloveitchik. There is a I'll show it to you a bit. It's inside. There's a great sefer on the Megillah. It's a commentary on the Megillah, sort of culled from the commentaries or the essays of Rav Soloveitchik. So he says a couple of things over here. This comment is said by several other people. So the opening of the Megillah starts off with the word Hamelech, that he was ruling. It has the connotation of attempting to rule, of subjugating, of organising his government, of being fearful of failure. The fact that Achashverosh was not firmly entrenched is responsible for many of the strange events. This is another comment by Rav Soloveitchik slightly later on. So just get rid of that. In the company of the distinguished aristocrats, Achashverosh tried to behave respectfully with some semblance of dignity. No matter how drunk he was, he understood that to order eunuchs to bring Vashti into the arena would alienate the entire aristocracy. However, so that's the first 180 days where sort of the dignitaries are there. However, in the final days of the party, this is referring to the final 7 days, when the nobles and rulers of the states departed Shushan, he felt free to act the way his coarse character told him to act. He cast off restrictive measures of decency and modesty. He was among his own. Such a chilling comment at the end over there. It really, really is. So over here we've got the other type of really sort of two different types of leader. You've got Achashverosh, who is so fearful that he tries to be a popularist, that sort of he wants everyone to love him. He wants everything to be taken with a positive spin. But ultimately, his leadership is completely bankrupt. The other half, the other side of the story, is you've got Nebuchadnezzar. Now reading through it, it's like quite hard not to have sort of a level of respect for Nebuchadnezzar, but he was a dictator who destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, who killed people who didn't like him. His failures were many, but he had a belief in himself that was such that he saw himself as being part of the divine mission. And I just think these two sort of leaders as paradigms are so. It's almost we can write this as the Book of Esther. There's a lot of debates how to read it, but it's certainly has elements of satire in it, and I think Nebuchadnezzar is true to an extent, is also sort of a satire of a certain paradigm of leaders. And I just think that 10 years ago, I don't think we'd be having this conversation, sort of thinking about sort of the type of leaders that we seem to have witnessed in recent years. You've got sort of the power. Sort of the power crazy dictator who sort of uses all sorts of methods in order to silence opposition, who believes that they are part of a divine mission. On the other hand, you've got popularists where sort of they're so sensitive to the flow of public opinion that they focus so much outwards that they end up having a bankrupt. They're bankrupt on the inside, and the consequences of that again are disastrous. Obviously, in the story of Purim, what saves the day is it's Esther being in the palace, who is an ordinary woman who ends up, being in the right place at the right time and undergoing a huge amount of self-sacrifice in order to save the Jewish people. Ditto in the times of Nebuchadnezzar, that there is Daniel in the palace, who there's a lot more to learn about Daniel, but utter integrity, refusing to compromise on his religion. The book writes about how he only ate sort of kosher food despite everything else serving him. That's explicit in the text, and how he continually prayed towards Jerusalem despite the risks involved, and that's why he got thrown into the lion's den eventually. But you've got someone with integrity on the inside who eventually brings salvation. And I think one of the key lessons of the story of the Megillah is that you've got, I was reading Erica Brown, who is a scholar in America. I hope some of you have had the occasion to read her books. They're absolutely amazing. So she's written a commentary on the Megillah, and she writes about one of the motifs is the edge of the palace, you've got the women from the harem who are trapped inside the palace. Sort of they're brought in. Esther is trapped inside the palace, whereas you've got Mordecai who is on the edge of the palace, and sort of it's the interface at the gate of the city. It's the gate of the palace where sort of the action happens. The Bigtan and Teresh, the two people two guardsmen, the two guards of the palace who attempt to assassinate the king. They're at the edge. Mordecai is always at the edge, speaking on the inside. Haman's house again on the outside of the palace, that can be seen from inside the palace, which is why they spot the gallows, and that's what they get hung upon. He gets hung upon, and it's sort of that line between the inside and the outside. And you've got the person within the integrity on the inside who is Esther, and you've got the person with the integrity on the outside who is Mordecai. I think in our own lives, that there's people who are on the inside, there's people on the outside, and I think that one of the key motifs of Megillas Esther is the interaction between the integrity on the inside and the integrity on the outside. And of course, obviously in the Purim story, ultimately that's what brings the redemption. I suppose if there's one takeaway that obviously we can't I don't think Ahasuerus or Nebuchadnezzar are role models, but in the stories we learn of the people with integrity, religious integrity, moral integrity, who are the ones through which the salvation occurs. And I think that's definitely a lesson sort of for us that we can take away. So thank you, and Purim Sameach for next week.
Thanks very much indeed, Rabbi Wayland, and wish everybody well. Just a reminder that next week's Lunch and
You've muted yourself.
How do I do that? All right, just hit the space bar. Next week's Lunch and Learn is with Rabbi Daniel Fine, and thank you for taking the time out and for joining us, particularly to Rabbi Wayland. A pleasure as always.
Have a wonderful week.
Very much.
Thank you.